States of America believes the time has come for the international community to use both diplomatic and economic pressure to bring North Korea to a place that it has avoided successfully now for more than a generation. And we will not rest and we will not relent until we achieve the objective of a denuclearized Korean peninsula.
Pence also said the US would work with Japan, China and other nations to get Pyongyang to give up its atomic weapon program. Asked what the DPRK must do, he repeated that all options are on the table and there they will remain. Pence added that the US believes the most productive pathway forward is dialogue among the family of nations to reach denuclearization. Tokyo was the second stop on Pence's 10-day tour of Asia. Well, South Korea has called on Japan to refrain from exacerbating security concerns on the Korean peninsula. It comes one day after the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe mentioned a contingency plan in a parliamentary committee session. Abe was quoted as saying that his government is working on plans for a crisis situation on the peninsula, referring to a potential influx of Korean refugees into Japan. The South Korean Foreign Ministry responded by saying there was a need to refrain from making remarks that could cause misunderstandings or that could negatively impact the peace and security of the peninsula. South Korean presidential candidates and media also accused Abe of fanning security concerns to serve his own political agenda and to help fulfill his aim of expanding the nation's military.
As tensions rise between the U.S. and North Korea, how prepared is Hawaii in the event of a nuclear attack? That question came up during the White House press briefing yesterday.
There are military contingency plans for almost every scenario. I think the president's made clear we're aware of the activities that they've engaged in, and we're monitoring them, and the national security team continues to keep them up to date.
Denny Roy is a senior fellow at the East-West Center, and here's what he thinks.
I don't have any doubt that the North Koreans are aware that if they use a nuclear weapon in anger, that it would mean the extinction of the regime and indeed of North Korea as a separate country. Having said that, I have to emphasize that there's no good reason for the North Koreans to actually use their nuclear weapons, since it would be suicidal.
Joining me now to discuss is Hawaii State Representative Matthew Lopresti. Thanks for being here, sir. So can you tell me what is exactly that you're trying to do to prepare for this type of event?
Well, thank you for having me. This resolution that we've introduced simply asks the state to prepare. No one's running around here with their saying the sky is falling or anything like that. But it's simply about updating our plans. The latest shelter plan that we have is from 1985. I was 11 years old, a kid during the Cold War. When we heard that some experts were saying that North Korea has or may soon have nuclear strike capability, we began to ask, where are those shelters again? They're not identified much anymore. They're certainly not stocked. And our population has shifted dramatically. So we need to prepare. It's the burden of government to be ready. So let's go through some of the things
that you're proposing in this legislation. Again, plans haven't been updated since 1985, as you mentioned. One, the Hawaii Department of Defense, you're asking to update its disaster preparedness plans, identify locations, as you just mentioned, for usable fallout shelters, upgrade outdated fallout shelters, update shelter signage, markings, provisions, public awareness. Also developing state lands that would accommodate mass storage infrastructure for shipping containers, as well as identify ports outside of the island that may be used in the case that ports are disabled in the event of a disaster.
Yeah, but this isn't simply about nuclear fallout or nuclear strikes. Hawaii, as an island state, is in the middle of the largest ocean on the planet, as you know. And so we're always looking at disaster preparedness, and that includes hurricanes, tsunamis, and with 11 military bases and U.S. Pacific Command here, we naturally have to think that we're a strategic and symbolic target. And we need to be prepared for those sorts of things. So in the event of natural disaster, part of this resolution asks us to look at having a long-term alternate harbor instead of Honolulu Harbor. That's
Representative, what sort of response are you getting to these requests?
A lot of people are grateful that people in government are actually taking this seriously enough to prepare. Some people suggest that you know, if there's a nuclear strike, then the game's over. But it's not that simple. You know, the 15 to 20 kiloton kind of warhead that the North Koreans may now or may in the near future be able to put on an ICBM is much smaller than the kind of megaton that, say, Russia or China might be able to use. So we're looking at a 2 to 3 mile radius, blast radius, and that means hundreds of thousands of survivors. It's our burden in government to prepare for worst case scenarios, however unlikely.
What do you hear from residents there as you're looking to increase this preparedness level, take these precautions against the worst? Is this sort of raising fears of the threats that we see coming from there?
No, I think people have a mature understanding of what the reality is. We have an unstable dictator in North Korea. We have an unpredictable president with a new foreign policy. You combine these things and people worry naturally. I think people are a little confused about the difference between bomb shelters versus fallout shelters. There are no civilian bomb shelters that I know of. Sean Spicer had mentioned that the military has contingency plans. I'm sure they do, but the civilian plans, like I said, haven't been updated since 1985. So people, I think, appreciate the fact that we really do need to take this seriously, because if it's not now, at least at some point, we need to have a plan. If we don't, then we fail the people.
All right. Well, you're trying to do your part. Thanks for joining us.
North Korea's envoy to the United Nations has warned that the U.S. actions can see a nuclear war break out at any moment. He's also said that Pyongyang is ready to respond to what he called growing threatening behavior from Washington.
It is crystal clear to everybody the United States, hell-bent on the dangerous cyber rattling in South Korea, little short of a nuclear arsenal, is arch-criminal harassing the peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula and the rest of Northeast Asia. If the United States dared opt for the military actions, the crying out for preemptive attack and the removal of the headquarters, the DPRK is ready to react to any mode of war desired by the American.
The North Korean UN deputy representative made the comments during a news conference which he called Monday. His comments followed the visit to South Korea of U.S. Vice President Mike Pence, who emphasized that the previous U.S. policy of strategic patience is over and all options are on the table. Some reports have suggested the U.S. may conduct a preemptive attack on North Korea. Despite the fact the nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, the USS Carl Vinson, and its strike group has been redeployed to the region, experts say such moves will have little influence over the strategy of the North Korean leadership.
Kim Jong-un will not consider the Carl Vinson's deployment around the Korean Peninsula or Trump's mention of a preemptive strike on North Korea when making a decision about a long-range missile launch or nuclear test. Kim more desires to display himself as a leader who can confront President Trump at any time and who is free from China or Russia in matters of nuclear weapons and missiles.
Pyongyang Saturday marked the 105th anniversary of the birth of its founder, Kim Il-sung, with much pomp and ceremony, showing off its recent missile developments as soldiers marched in a show of solidarity behind leader Kim Jong-un. Over the near term, the confrontation between Washington and Pyongyang is likely to continue. The Korean People's Army will celebrate its 85th anniversary on April 25th. And the ongoing large-scale U.S.-South Korea military exercises are scheduled to run through to the end of this month. Frank Smith, Press TV, Seoul.
The president to speak momentarily. You'll see it live here. First, though, continuing coverage of rising tensions with North Korea. Chinese officials are now defending their trade practices with the dictatorship there after North Korea used Chinese-made trucks to tow missiles in a military parade. As I reported here a short time ago, a spokesman for China's foreign ministry says the country conducts normal business with its neighbors in North Korea and abides by all UN sanctions. Sumi Terry is here. She's a former senior analyst on North Korean issues at the CIA, also served on the National Security Council under the administrations of two presidents, President George W. Bush and President Obama. Thanks for coming.
Thank you for having me on.
How are we handling this?
Well, right now, we're not handling it too well. But in fairness, no one handled it well. This problem goes back to the early 1990s on Clinton administration, the Bush administration, Obama administration, and now the Bush administration. So.
Now the rhetoric has been ratcheted up,
Yes.
and the threats are out there.
Yes.
And what are we to make of that, and how it might affect Kim Jong-un?
Well, the problem with this kind of brinkmanship policy coming out of Washington, actually, is that we're putting ourselves in a bind. Because either you have to back down and lose face and credibility with our allies and our enemies, or we have to now follow through. And what are we going to do? Are we going to really have a military strike against North Korea? It's a very dangerous step to take. That would be a very dangerous step to take for us.
But because of North Korea's capabilities as it relates to Japan and South Korea?
Yeah, absolutely. Because of conventional artillery alone, there are more than 10,000 artillery pieces that's zeroed in on Seoul right now. We have 220 million people living in Seoul. We have some 150,000 American expats living in Seoul. We have 28,500 American soldiers living in South Korea right now. And of course, Seoul can be devastated. North Korea does not have to use a nuclear weapon. Just conventional artillery alone is quite dangerous.
What is the better course of action in your estimation?
Well, I am for trying to put maximum pressure on North Korea and China. So I understand the sentiment behind this. But I do think if China falls through and does not rein in North Korea, and I'm not holding my breath, then we do have to ratchet up sanctions, and we have to pursue secondary sanctions against Chinese banks and Chinese entities that continue to do illicit business with North Korea.
China is not interested in helping that much because of its own interests regarding its border and otherwise, right?
Right. I mean, China does not want nuclear North Korea, but their standing policy, long-standing policy, always has been no war, no instability, and no nukes, and that in that order. So China has always supported North Korea historically, just because it does not want to see regime collapse or regime instability.
Sumi Terry, I'm sorry the time is cut short.
US Vice President Mike Pence on Wednesday visited the USS Ronald Reagan aircraft carrier stationed in Japan. On the second leg of his four-nation Asia-Pacific tour, Pence spoke to a crowd of representatives from both the Japanese and US militaries at the US's Yokosuka Naval Base south of Tokyo. The Nimitz-class aircraft carrier is undergoing scheduled maintenance at its home port. During his speech, Pence reassured Japan that it could count on the military support of the US.
Beyond this noble ship and the carrier strike group that it leads, by the year 2020, this ocean will boast 60% of our Navy's fleet. And the skies above already have F-35 Joint Strike Fighters flying for freedom. The full range of the United States military capability is dedicated to the protection of Japan. Japan, you are our friend. You are our ally. And on that foundation, we will face the future together.
Now, acting President Huang said that the U.S. and the ROK have agreed to further strengthen the readiness of their alliance in response to the DPRK's growing threat by ensuring the early deployment and operation of THAAD. This is now what Vice President Pence said during the press conference.
We will continue to deploy the THAAD missile defense system as a defensive measure called for by the alliance and for the alliance.
Now, Dr. Walsh, how do you interpret Vice President Pence's words, "we will continue"? Is his statement a self-contradiction inside the Trump administration or just a soothing response to the ROK's urging for early deployment of THAAD?
I think it's posturing right now. The notion that one of the aides on that trip said that they would wait and see about deploying THAAD until the election and the new president, I think reflects two things. One, an accommodation to reality. If a new president comes into office and is absolutely opposed to the missile defense system, it's very hard to imagine politically that the U.S. is going to force its ally to accept it. So part of that is just political realism. But secondly, it also speaks to the evolving relationship between China and the United States after the summit. Obviously, China and Russia, but particularly China, have expressed their opposition to THAAD, and there seems to be some cooperation blooming in very small ways right now between the U.S. and China. And so this gives the Americans a way out, as well as a little leverage, to say, if you keep helping me, I will help you, and maybe we will slow play THAAD. So both political realism and also reflecting the changing nature of the U.S.-China relationship.
Professor Moon, what is your take on this question?
But I think whoever gets elected as a new president of South Korea, he should go through policy review of the deployment of American THAAD in South Korea, because now there are big debate on the procedural appropriateness of the deployment, the decision to deploy American THAAD system in South Korea. Therefore, I think new president will look into the procedural dimension of the deployment. At the same time, all those candidates were not informed about the decision to deploy American THAAD in South Korea. Therefore, new president will be looking into its military utility and its economic cost and its geopolitical implications. Therefore, I think that if we have a new president, particularly Moon Jae-in, he will look in the case, from very fresh aspect.
Now, from a technical perspective, we are really not long before the presidential election is held. That's beginning of May. Technically, if the United States and the acting government of the ROK at this moment decide to speed up the deployment of THAAD, is it possible for them to finish by that time? Dr. Welsh?
Well, I doubt it. I doubt that very seriously. And moreover, it would be a political slap in the face to the candidates who are currently running. I mean, Mr. Trump came to office wanting to reverse everything that Mr. Obama did, and certainly the likely winner of the South Korean election is going to be a liberal, more liberal than the previous president, President Park. And so he should understand that the new guy coming into office is going to want to make some changes. And they're going to have to work together, right? If the U.S. and South Korea are not on the same page, it's going to be very difficult to make progress on the problem of North Korea. So there's no, I don't think, incentive or payoff for the president to antagonize the candidates before they've even taken office. So I think it makes sense to wait the 30 days. Nothing's going to happen in 30 days. And if they try to rush it and the new president comes in and asks them to dismantle it, that's bad for everyone. That's a no win at all. So that's what I think will happen.
And Professor Moon, let me just be clear what you were saying. Basically, you are saying the plan to deploy the THAAD will be stalled anyway, as the policy will have to be reviewed after the presidential election. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, naturally, and I agree with Dr. Welsh. In other words, South Korean, new president should go through that process. Right now, some members of National Assembly are thinking about making, petition to the Constitutional Court. Some citizens are about to file for the environmental impact statement, the petition. Therefore, there could be a myriad of, the legal and procedural complaint from the civil society. Therefore, new president should accommodate. Look, South Korea is a country where president was impeached. Therefore, new president cannot ignore the grievances coming from the National Assembly members and the citizens.
Mm-hmm. Now, as for China's most recent response to the deployment of THAAD, let's listen to what the Foreign Ministry spokesperson had to say.
I think everyone has noted that ever since the US and the ROK decided to deploy THAAD in the peninsula, the situation has become more tense instead of cooling down. Security in the ROK is more strained rather than more secure. Thus we urge all involved once again to stop the THAAD deployment immediately.
Dr. Welsh, I want to come to you, and you also mentioned a little bit. Now, since the U.S. has been pressuring China to play a central role in resolving the DPRK nuclear issue, shouldn't China's concern with the THAAD be taken into better consideration so that both sides will have some gains in working harder and cooperating better?
Well, to borrow a phrase from North Korean negotiations past, I would say action for action, word for word. In other words, of course there has to be some reciprocity. Both sides have to try to meet the needs of the other. And so this is what I think that's going to look like. I think we saw China exert some subtle pressure on North Korea over the weekend with a major Chinese newspaper floating the idea of an oil cutoff or a slowdown in oil exports, as well as obviously the temporary ban on flights to Pyongyang. So China is doing part of what the U.S. wants to do, and then China's going to expect something from the U.S. And I'm guessing one of two things, or maybe both. One is they're going to pressure the U.S. to return to the bargaining table, to have direct talks with North Korea, and secondly, to slow down or perhaps freeze the installation of the THAAD missile defense system, which China is very concerned about. Now, I'm not a big fan of THAAD, but I believe the Chinese official probably exaggerates the degree to which THAAD has affected the North Korean situation. I think if we had THAAD or no THAAD, the North Korean situation would be bad right now. There are larger things going on than just THAAD. But obviously, to the Chinese, THAAD is very important. And so I would think that they will press the U.S. And it may be that this hint we had this last couple of days is a sign that there may be some accommodation to that request.
Professor Moon, picking up what Dr. Welsh was saying, putting aside China's concern about THAAD from its own strategic perspective, how do you think the THAAD system is weighing on the DPRK nuclear issue? Do you think THAAD is helping with the situation or making the DPRK going further in their escalation?
Now, once South Korea allowed the deployment of American THAAD in South Korea, then means that could imply that South Korea is not interested in dialogue and negotiation. Therefore, in a so-called head-to-head in a confrontation with North Korea. Therefore, that is not desirable. Therefore, in other words, THAAD or other issues or sanctions on North Korea should be used as an instrument of bringing North Korea to negotiation table. That is the most important one. There is no other choice but to resolve North Korean problems through dialogue and negotiation. We should keep that in mind very clearly.
Dr. Welsh, my last question to you. What is your assessment of the situation at this moment? Are we closer to an outbreak of war, however long that is, or are we seeing a de-escalation of the situation?
Well, right now, I think we're at an inflection point. And often those two things happen at the same time. As things get more dangerous, there's an opportunity, people sort of focus on the problem, and it creates an opportunity to put it on a different track. So I think we've seen some positive developments, but it all depends on what lessons are learned. If the leaders in Beijing and Washington draw the correct lessons from what happened this weekend, then we might be able to put this on a positive track with negotiations and other policies. But this is very fragile, and it could easily just, begin to spiral down where we have the same old action-reaction. And if we go back to that, it could be very dangerous.
Professor Moon, what is your take on this question?
Now, there is one more observation point. There is on April 25th, that is the 85th anniversary of founding of North Korea's People's Army. And there may be a good chance that North Korea undertake the 6th nuclear testing. Then they can really screw up everything. Therefore, I really hope that North Korea would take a more, reserved posture and try to really come back to negotiation table. Really, I think that, if North Korea undertakes the 6th nuclear testing, there may be a good chance that President Trump could take a military action on North Korea. Therefore, we should, try to avoid that kind of catastrophic development on the Korean Peninsula.